Hello, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. My name is Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. How are you doing today?
We hope you guys are having a wonderful Sunday, and thank you for sharing part of your Sunday with us. So we've got a great show for you, and I'm going to hand it over to Danya for the introductions.
Yes, we do. So I know you guys see this very handsome man sitting on the screen with us. His name
I'm
is
flattered.
Well, I'm just telling the truth. I'm just telling the truth. Well, his name is Trooper Charles Williams, and Trooper Williams is a volunteer at the Buffalo Soldier National 2006. He is also known as the Major. So we're going to go into that to find out why that is. But Trooper Williams attended and graduated from my school's one of my schools what do you call it? Because I went to Jackson State.
Okay,
Yes.
swag.
Yes, swag, baby. So, yes, Trooper Williams is attended and graduated from Prairie View A&M, and he received a BS in biology and was commissioned into the Army as a second lieutenant. He's received an honorable discharge from the Army at the rank of major. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. This is going to be a very exciting show, and I'm just excited to learn about the Buffalo Soldiers and share the stories that you can tell us for Black History Month.
Outstanding. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Yes.
Yes, especially as right before we went live, chatting about, because like you said, you're in Houston, we were chatting about the weather in Texas, so just happy to hear that you weren't so badly affected despite the deep freeze in Houston. So again, just really appreciative that you could join us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess we should talk about a little bit about the origin story of the Buffalo Soldiers, kind of how they came into being. So my understanding is they were kind of an offshoot, or they came out of the U.S. colored troops. Is that correct?
Well, yes, well, partially. We can't really discuss the Buffalo Soldiers without mentioning the United States colored troops and who they were, because of the job that they did. I think that changed a lot of attitudes among how Black soldiers would perform in the field. In 1863, President Lincoln decided to create the United States colored troops. And the U.S. colored troop would consist of 178 regiments during that time period. They would incur an enlistment period of, I think it was about 3 years during that time. And they started off making about $10 a month, and they decided that they should protest, and eventually they brought the same salaries up to the Black soldiers, which was about $13 a month. Now, the U.S. Colored troops didn't come into being until President Lincoln decided to issue an executive order, better known as the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation. Now, at that point, it would have been dangerous for slaves to leave the plantation. They probably would have been shot. So the devil was in the detail with the executive order. Sections, I think it's 9 and 10, clearly instruct the slaves not to leave the plantation until federal troops arrive in the area. And but after that, then let's fast forward to April 1865, when General Lee surrendered in Appomattox. Well, there were several regiments, African American regiments, who witnessed that, that entire event. In fact, they were really dogging General Lee all that day, and had been for most of the week. And so it was, they were there. They were fighting for their freedom. After General Lee surrendered, um, Texas decided that they weren't ready to quite surrender. And so General Grant decided that they'd never been occupied, so why don't we just send some troops around the peninsula of Florida into the Gulf Coast area and land them somewhere in the Rio Grande area. And then they can't say they weren't occupied. And that did happen. So what's interesting, we had difficulty in trying to determine which troops were available in Galveston, Texas, during the reading of the General Order Number 3, which is the announcement that slaves were free in Texas. And that was General Hall Granger who did that. We later discovered, about 3 or 4 months ago, we discovered the name of the actual regiment, Black regiment that was there. It was the 29th Illinois, and they celebrate that event. So now everybody is freed, and Congress decided to reorganize the military. And they did so. They were coming from a wartime situation to a peacetime. And they ordered the military to establish 6 all-Black regiments. And the military responded by designating 2 cavalry units, the 9th and the 10th, and 4 infantry regiments, which 2 years later, they consolidated into the 24th and the 25th Infantry Regiments. So those were formed 1 year after the Civil War had concluded, 1866, we're talking about. So had it not been for the type of performance that the U.S. colored troops performed at and the level that they performed at, who can say if the military would have wanted the Black soldier in there, because they had to prove everything. Nothing was given to them. They had to prove themselves every day of the year. But they did it in spite of the hardships and the obstacles that were placed in front of them, and they actually performed outstandingly.
Well, that was going to actually be my follow-up question. Because I was very curious, because the African American men in the USCT had already kind of established their fighting reputation. Especially there was the famous battle in Richmond, where they had broken through the Confederate lines and really had earned respect. And I was just wondering if the achievements that they won in the Civil War would have transferred over into, I guess, their careers as Buffalo Soldiers. But you're kind of telling me the prejudices against them about Black men serving in the military still kind of, why do you think it still followed them like that?
Well, for some reason, since the Revolutionary War and the origin of the country, Blacks have fought in each and every battle. Every one. There's not one that we haven't fought in. And we have a favorite saying at the museum: we were always there. We were always there. You can go back to the American Revolutionary War. The first American to be killed was Crispus Attucks. He was an African American sailor who was fatally killed. He was the first one. So the first person to die for freedom of the country was a Black man, Christmas
Wow.
apples. But the there are there's a movie, Glory. I don't know if you've probably seen it. It features the story about the 54th Massachusetts. Incidentally, we have their casualty list by name at the museum. But they perform so outstandingly well that all of the newspapers picked up that that charge and how valiant they were, and they died, but they still continued the assault. The white soldiers who witnessed it, they developed immediate respect for them after that. And so if that was quite gratifying to know that they earned a degree of respect and was recognized by the military, because had they not, I don't think they would have the opportunity to serve. Because see, prior to the Civil War, they could fight in battles, but after the battle was over with, they had to pack up their things and go back home. All that changed in 1866 when Congress reorganized the military.
So I'm kind of curious where these men were coming from were they coming more from one part of the United States than another, or were they kind of coming from all over the East Coast by that point?
Actually, the Buffalo Soldier or the Black Soldier came from primarily ranks of slaves. But you also had a lot of free men of color at that time too. We saw that from our research, we noticed that there were quite a few recruits who enlisted from the Washington area, Kentucky, Tennessee. Not to mention, if they could get away in the South, they would join. So, and they came from all over the country, actually.
And I guess one of the most obvious questions to ask, I've heard lots of stories about how they got the name Buffalo Soldier.
Oh yes, that's the number one question. In fact, there are a few things that we want individuals to know who visit the museum. We want them to know about four things about the Buffalo Soldier. One is the year they were formed, 1866. We want them to know the four historical units, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry. They were regiment-sized units, and the 24th and the 25th Infantry Regiment. We want people to know that. And we want them to know how they got the nickname Buffalo Soldier. Well, the name came from in 1867, the 10th Cavalry was skirmishing up on the high plains with the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne were known as the lords of the high plains. They were excellent warriors and outstanding horsemen. But they encountered the 10th Cavalry, and the 10th Cavalry gave them everything that they could handle. And so they dubbed the 10th Cavalry as Wild Buffalo. That was the actual translation, Wild Buffalo.
Wow.
Then generically, as the name became more popular, it applied to every African American soldier during that time period, because the Buffalo Soldier period would run concurrent with segregation of the military.
So I guess the nickname that the indigenous people gave them, Wild Buffalo, was that a mark of respect about the fierceness that they're fighting, or what was behind that nickname?
You're absolutely correct. The name was given to them out of respect for the fierce fighting ability. Their fighting spirit reminded them of the spirit of the buffalo, and some some African American males had curly hair, and the hair reminded them of the mane between the two horns, the antlers, the horns of the. They call that sacred mane. I think that's what the Indians referred to that as being. But and primarily it was based on the fighting, their fighting spirit.
So do I have this correct? So the people who were supposed to be their enemies seem to have had more respect for them than their white countrymen. Do I have that right?
Well, there are controversies now regarding the name, but we feel that the Cheyenne is a good representation of how they felt about encountering the Black cavalrymen. Uh, we we um, we documented a letter from the wife of a cavalry officer. I think he was stationed at Fort Riley in the late 1870s. And she writes home to her family describing the soldiers that her husband commands. And she described them as little monkeys, but the hanging on a horseback, but the Indians referred to them as buffalo soldiers. And I think that was around 1870. But there's controversy regarding if the every Native American agreed with that name, and and for a while that was a time when uh, Black soldiers probably didn't warm up to that name until they understood how Indians name things. They compared everything to nature practically, and they saw the Black man out there, and it reminded him of the buffalo. So
Wow.
that's how it came about.
So
So
I've got,
given the fact that
I
this
love history.
is,
so do
I
we.
do
So do
too. We all do. Given the fact that this is Black History Month, what about the Buffalo Soldiers would you think that everybody really needs to know? I want to get that out right off the top.
I think everyone needs to know that the Buffalo Soldiers were very much aware of what they accomplished or failed to accomplish would some way impact the rest of the Black population. And they had several mottos. The 9th Cavalry, for example, was uh, uh, let's see, what was it? Ready and forward. And that's the 10th Cavalry, ready and forward. And the 9th Cavalry was we can, we will. And and they tried to live up to those mottos. And you could even say that they were so good out on the Western frontier that no one, you could actually call them a special force. They spent more time in the American West than any other military unit, those, historical units. They stayed out there for 2.5 decades, uh, trying to meet their primary mission was to protect settlers moving west. And so when you hear the term manifest destiny and all that, you could say the Buffalo Soldiers are very much a part of that, because a lot of historians have said, a lot of white historians have also acknowledged that it would have taken 50 years for them to settle the West had it not been for the job that the Buffalo Soldiers did. They did a variety of different jobs, uh, just not fight doing Native Americans during the Indian Wars, but there are a lot of other duties that they performed as well.
Wow.
I just learned something new. I had
Mhm.
no idea that they were protecting pioneers. I'm curious what the pioneers must have made to them, considering all the kind of anti-Black propaganda that they would have heard growing up. So that, the meeting of the two must have been very interesting.
We have accounts from each one of those units, that in the areas where they operated at, they were very, very well known. They knew that they were there. uh, some towns were pleased to see them, and some towns didn't want them anywhere in their businesses anywhere. And so typically, when they would arrive at a town to rid a town of outlaws, such as Billy the Kid, those kind of people,
Mhm.
they would encamp or bivouac on the edge of town. And people were always curious about it. But you can imagine seeing a large number of soldiers, and they're all black, and they're riding proud and looking tough. And they were really tough. they they had more campaigns than any other cavalry unit in the military during that time. They were known as the best horsemen in the military. In fact, West Point, they were 100 Buffalo soldiers from the 9th and the 10th Cavalry were rotated each year to West Point to teach cavalry drills and horsemanship skills. And the place where they did that at West Point is called Buffalo Soldier Field. It is still there.
Oh, wow.
Hmm.
It just,
So the Army recognized their work. They recognized their work.
That's awesome.
it's just amazing that they're like one of the least known military units, in terms of American military history. That I I certainly never learned about them in school. Let's just put it that way. They were never
Well,
mentioned.
nor did I. And
I mean, but the thing is that this is even more fascinating because they recognize them throughout the Army. It sounds like, I mean, throughout the military, they recognized what they did, how they did it, yet they didn't share it.
that's right.
Which,
They didn't. They
you know,
didn't share it.
yeah, they didn't share the information about them, what they did, but they could not say, we wouldn't be here without this. We wouldn't be there without that. They did these things. They taught our white they taught our white counterparts how to do certain things at this particular field, horsemen and other stuff that they had to do. They actually taught them, but you do not get that credit in the books.
No, you don't.
But they give that credit military wise.
Yeah, look how long it took for the information, the story to get out about the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen, they stood on the soldiers of the shoulders of the Buffalo Soldiers. The all of the units that came after the Buffalo Soldier, you could say that they stood on their shoulders because they performed very, very well in the field during the period that they were out there. It's just some of the things that happened to them is just, you would think that they would have been more progressive in reporting the accomplishments, but it wasn't like that at all. Even though we have between the ages, the years of 1867 to the early 1890s, Buffalo Soldiers had earned approximately 16 Medal of Honor. So you can see that they were being recognized by their commanders. But if you spend 2.5 decades out in the field, you'll get quite good at what you're doing.
But again, I just saying
I think they had the highest morale of any of the cavalry units. They had the highest enlistment rate, and they had the lowest desertion rate of any of the cavalries. That includes the white ones too.
I mean, I'm just shaking my head because I remember learning about Manifest Destiny and the migration to the West and the settlements of, that part of the country. We even had a blank map where we had to draw in those routes, those trails that going from east to west. Never mentioned anything about Buffalo Soldiers being there, protection force or anything like that. But I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about their living conditions. Because I have an ancestral uncle who was a Buffalo Soldier, and he served in Fort Grant in the Arizona Territory.
Right.
I've seen those pictures, and I've seen the contemporary pictures of the fort where he lived and worked. He was a cook, by the way, and it looked rough. It looked really, like, obviously nothing was paved. There was no sidewalks. It was all muddy and dirty and kind of shack-like looking buildings. I mean, was that kind of typical of a fort of that period?
Yeah, that's about that's probably an accurate description of a fort. Now in Texas, we're fortunate. We have several frontier forts that we can visit and to get a good idea of how it must have been for soldiers, cavalry soldiers, or any soldier during that period. Um, and the 13 forts in Texas, it's at least 13. Uh, but actually, in the state of Texas, there were two fort lines. One was pre-Civil War, and then the second fort line was post-Civil War. Because of the Indian period. um, but my favorite fort is way out in West Texas called Fort Davis, and that fort was occupied by African American soldiers. The Ninth Cavalry were the first ones out of that group to go to Texas, and their mission was to protect the old San Antonio El Paso road. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Texas and made to drive from San Antonio to El Paso. Let me tell you, it is a jump.
Wow.
It may take a month by maybe a couple months by wagon, just to get from San Antonio to Fort Davis, because it's way out in Fort West Texas, and there is nothing out there but the great Comanche War Trail, and that's why it was there. So, but to answer your question, Brian, yeah, it was dirty. It was hard. Um, but they were professional soldiers and they took pride in what they did. And they got better too. Of course, you know the story about blacks not being able to read, being allowed to learn to read. And the military realized that was a strong possibility that their soldiers would not be able to read or write. So the military did something different. They decided to assign chaplains to each one of those four units. Now, the job of the chaplains were not only to administer to their spiritual needs, but also to teach them how to read, write, and do math, simple math. And one of my favorite of those chaplain was one with the 24th Infantry. His name was Alan Allensworth. Colonel Allensworth was one of the higher ranking officers that were African American. And he created a lesson plan and a curriculum to teach Black soldiers and their dependents how to read, write, and do math. Now, the military, after a while, they recognized his work and they adopted his lesson plan and curriculum as the military's educational plan for enlisted soldiers.
Wow.
So Alan's work was one of my favorites because he did all of that. But after they learned to read, write, and they were eager to do it, performance improved. They could write reports. I have to give the white officers a great deal of credit, because typically they were the ones to make sure that the enlisted men were, doing their homework and continuing their studies even when they were in the field. And they even resorted to teaching too.
So before we move on to the museum, I was hoping you could spend just a little time talking about the unexpected link between Buffalo soldiers and Colonel Custer, because that's just a mad story.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting story. When the military decided to form these all Black units, they tried to they tried to screen the officers that they wanted to lead these particular men. And one of the first officers that they approached was General Custer, at that time as a general. And he turned down uh, the opportunity. Um, Let me go back. He was a general during the Civil War, but when they reorganized, he was a colonel. He was bumped down to a colonel. But and that was pretty common back then during that time period. Uh, but he decided he would not accept the command of the Ninth Cavalry as offered to him. They offered him a bonus and everything else, a promotion, everything to get him to do it. But he insisted that he didn't feel that black soldiers would make good cavalrymen, and which was not unusual during the day. Let's think about this. It was the 1800s, the 19th century. The attitudes were still racist, real raw. And many of the soldiers that commanded them did, they had those type of attitudes or those sentiments. But nevertheless, they persevered and and performed outstandingly. Now, it's not to say they didn't have problems along the way. They had quite a few. But in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, we know that there was not a single Buffalo soldier among those soldiers who died during that massacre that took out Custer's entire regiment. But later on, a few years after that, um, the Seventh Cavalry would get in trouble again, and the closest uh, help they could get was from the Ninth Cavalry, the one that they turned down, the one that he turned down years before. But they rode all night. They covered a lot of miles, and they made it there to save those troopers of the Seventh Cavalry Regiment. And but the Buffalo soldiers knew that they had dodged the bullet when they heard about the Little Bighorn and what happened to Custer.
So I have a question that I wanted to ask, because you seem to be telling us a pattern of the military, and it's something that I've actually heard about the military, and that was they were making strides as far as racism and integrating was concerned well before America as a whole was doing it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, why? But
say that you could
why
say
pause?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, why pause or break? With doing all of this, making all of these, strides, because I mean, they were teaching, they were, they made sure that they could read, they made sure they could write, they made sure they could do reports like they were supposed to, and in turn we turned around and we were teaching them in certain instances. So it was a give and take lifestyle, it sounds like. However, they didn't share that outside.
No. And those soldiers, the black soldiers who joined the cavalry, they got, most of them got a taste of it when they were, what they were assigned to the USCT. Quite a few of those soldiers, they were vets by that time. They came over to join the ranks of the Buffalo Soldiers. So, they got quite a bit of experience. I think one of the big problems that they encountered when we talk about the officers, the first officers to command the Buffalo Soldier units were white. We wouldn't get a black officer until 11 years later, and that would have been Henry O. Flipper, the first African American to graduate from West Point in the 19th century. And then he was followed by Alexander, and then another officer, black officer. His name was Charles Young. Charles Young was probably the most celebrated of those. and he went on to command the 9th Cavalry Regiment. And he also became the first park superintendent of the national parks, because the military assigned several of the cavalry units, most notably the 9th Cavalry was assigned to take care of Yosemite Park and Sequoia. And both of those parks are in California. So there are accomplishments that you would not believe. And that's where our museum comes into play. When we're trying to locate stories, we hear about them, we investigate them, we try and research them, and we will build, if we can, we'll build exhibits as soon as we get enough information about it.
We definitely need to get into the museum, because as you're talking and everything, we've had several people that have has already stated how they know that they have ancestors who were Buffalo Soldiers. One actually gave, a couple of them have given names, and they, 10th, talking about the 10th Regiment. I think she said his name was Sergeant Benjamin Brand, or I have to scroll it back, but she's a descendant of his, and there's several. So yeah, go ahead, Brian. Let's talk about the museum.
I would love to talk about the museum. It's a beautiful building. You guys should see it, and we want you to come down and experience it for yourself.
So that was a very nice segue, because I wasn't aware that you guys did that kind of research, but obviously if you're doing exhibits, you would do. So what are some of the topics that you touch on in your exhibitions?
Well, we will. I'll give you. We have 3 galleries basically. We feature artifacts. We have about 4,500 various artifacts that we can place in exhibit. We have about 5 Connex containers of just artifacts that we've collected over the years. We don't turn away anything. If someone does donate to us an artifact or item from an ancestor, a Buffalo Soldier ancestor, we're going to keep it. We're not getting rid of it. So that's one of the ways we were able to build a lot of exhibits just from simply donations. And once people find out that there's a place that they can send something, like an artifact from an ancestor, most people are willing to do it because they know they'll get a chance to go and see it displayed one day. So, and that's a gratifying feeling. In fact, I have, my family donated a picture to the museum featuring my great uncle who served in France. And in the picture, there's inset of Amy J. Scott, who was the first special assistant to the Secretary of War. And then also in that same picture frame, it's a Black commander who, his name is Dennison, who commanded a National Guard unit in Chicago, Illinois. So it's quite interesting, I think.
That's true. I mean, they're everywhere. I've been researching someone for the Library of Congress who was a Buffalo Soldier, and he was working up in Montana. So I mean, the range that they were working in was incredible. But
yes, I'm telling you, it's amazing. We were in 2010. We were invited to attend a commemoration of the Big Burn. And the Big Burn was about the huge forest fire that impacted Idaho and parts of Montana, burned off property the size of Connecticut, the state of Connecticut.
wow.
They said, and they haven't had a worse fire that way in ever. And that's saying a lot when we consider the fires that, the strike up in California on the West Coast. But this thing was really historical in nature. They sent the elements of the 25th in there from Missoula, and another group came from Fort Wright in Washington State, and essentially they saved the town of Wallace, Idaho, and the town of Avery, Idaho, and it was written about. And there's a docu-film. We contributed to that film, incidentally, too.
Oh, wow.
It was a lot of fun doing it. But if you visit that area, you can actually see the burn lines. It's still there from over 100 years ago.
Wow.
It's quite impressive. But they wanted to recognize the Buffalo Soldiers, and they invited, they decided, let's contact the Buffalo Soldier Museum and see if they can send us some guys up here to participate in this ceremony. And of course, we were glad to go. But yeah, I've enjoyed a lot of experiences since I've retired with this museum. It's a lot of fun. We do a lot of interesting things for the community.
So because we are also a genealogy show and people will be curious about records, so the bulk of the records are actually held by the National Archives in DC, and then there's another tranche of records that are held by its annex in College Park in Maryland. Does the museum have records or copies of the reports or any kind of documents relating to them?
We most of the documents that we would come into possession of would probably come from the archives. We not to mention we get copies from and share information from other museums too. So that's another resource. And I recall reading an account of Henry O. Flipper, the first African American to graduate from West Point. He was interviewed by a reporter in New York, and we had a copy of that. I don't know why, I forget how we got that, but it was an interesting interview because one of the questions he asked him, he said, "Do you expect that the white soldiers will obey you? You're a black officer?" And he said yes, and he believed that. And although I don't think that ever happened, but I thought that was striking answer to the question when it was posed.
One of our people have a question about that is in the records. Talking about research. Rita Shipman says, as much as I love to research in person, what are some of the best online sites to research ancestors who were Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, of course, the National Archives is a good place to start because you can request their military records, you can request their civil service record, you can request their medical records, there's selective service board because once male got to be 18, he had to register. So they did that then as well. So all those records you can obtain from the archives. There was a fire there, I think in the 1970s, somewhere in there, and a lot of those records were destroyed. They were burned. In fact, I retrieved a record from one of my ancestors, and you could tell the edges of the document was burned.
Wow.
So that's one place, perhaps the main place. But you can also ancestry.com. I don't want to give them a plug, but they've got a huge database. And then there's a free one, Family Search, good. I'm trying to recall if there's anything I'm leaving out. And just get on the computer and just start searching.
Were there stories in the newspapers about the Buffalo Soldiers during that time period?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because in Galveston, for example, during the reading of General Order Number 3 by Major Granger, Major General Granger, rather, we actually requested information from the Galveston newspaper, and they didn't have anything that we could use in terms of Pacifics. There was little written about them during that period. We received a lot of information from Illinois regarding the USCT unit that they were celebrating and have been celebrating since that time. We didn't know anything about it, because if you're aware that if you've been keeping up with the Juneteenth celebration, it's now spread throughout the country just about, and there's a movement underfoot that they are going to try and make it a national holiday, but but I don't know if that'll happen, but it's being talked about very strongly.
Wow.
What kind of outreach work or educational work does the museum engage in?
Oh, good question. Okay, not only we're not just a museum, we're like a community hub center. And we have space that you can host meetings. We have the founders room, the board room. They can hold up to 75 people. You can rent. We have reasonable rental rates. We have a large auditorium area where we can hold weddings, banquets, family reunions, dances, you name it, it's enough space. It would hold 500 people. And it's the building that we're in was built in 1924 by the Houston Light Guard. The Houston Light Guard was the first militia to be formed after the Civil War in Texas. And they were a drill team oriented type of a unit. They competed in different drill competitions around the country, and apparently they were pretty good because with their prize money they earned, they built the building that we're in right now. And when we obtained the building, it came with its historical memorabilia, their uniforms.
Wow.
I mean, the building is a historical building in its own rights. And the mayors, we've had 3 mayors, they thought it was a perfect match. We get a lot of support in Houston. Our name recognition is very good here. So, but getting back to some of the things that we do, we do so many things. I wanted to make sure I list the most important ones. But we hold educational seminars. We have a youth program. In fact, one of our acting programs that we're getting ready for, if not for the pandemic, excuse me. All right.
That's okay.
They're already getting away. But anyway, we're in the process of trying to get our inner city youth exploration program off the ground for this year. It will feature in taking kids out to the historical forts and hiking, camping. We have an excellent rapport with the Texas Park and Wildlife Department. In fact, they awarded us a grant to implement the exploration program. And so, and this is about our 3rd or 4th one with them. And incidentally, the state of Texas, within the Texas Park and Wildlife Department, they also have a Buffalo Soldier division. And they travel around the state and do what we do for free. But we know all those guys. They're outstanding and they do a very good job. They're one of our closest partners. Okay, also, let's see, politicians are in and out of the building constantly. Um, let's see, what else? Okay, you guys have any questions?
Yeah, yeah, we come with them. One person. One person, Help Whitman, she wanted to ask a question to you, and I don't know if this is the best question to ask you. It might be better for the next show, but you might know something about it. She says she wondered why some USCT soldiers had aliases. She said her grandfather served and believed his brother, and they both had an alias. So did that alias, I guess, move over into, the Buffalo Soldiers or from USCT?
No, that's a good question. I can't answer that.
Okay. It's for next week.
Military people like to give handles, and I know when I went on active duty as a second lieutenant, my battalion commander called me Chuck. And I looked around. I said, he said, "Chuck, you're Chuck," and I became Chuck.
Wow.
And it's funny, it's followed me all the way through the military. People, military love handles, so.
Until you became the major.
So I don't know if you necessarily will be able to answer this question either, but the men who served, did they considering they were coming from all over the country, did they tend to remain where they served, or did they serve, muster out, and then go back to where they came from originally?
Most of them would muster out and go back to where they came from originally, but we had a lot of Black soldiers remain in the state. Texas was big for cowboys, and we had the surge of the Black cowboy along about that time, probably around the 1870s. And, I think they said about 20% of the cowboys in Texas during that time period were African American. And we know that between 1869 and the 1890s that the Black cavalry represented 20% of the of the country's cavalry units.
Wow. So did they have any did they do anything on the Hawaiian Islands? That question was asked by Philip Logan.
Say that again.
Did the Buffalo Soldiers have anything to do with the Hawaiian Islands?
No, the Philippines they did, and in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. They also participated in the Boxer Rebellion in China. Let's see, where is World War I, World War II. I mean, they've been there.
Again, their work outside of the States, I would be really curious to find out how they were received. As I said before the show started, I was talking about, again, my great uncle, well, my 2 times great uncle, Crockett Sheffield, who did serve in the Philippines, and it looked like he stayed there. And I was just curious what you were saying, they served in China, they served in Cuba, they were in the Philippines. What did those people make of them?
Oh, I think it's hard to say actually. Without accounts from those who were actually present, because they were a military organization, and they were there to do a job. So I'm not really familiar with how the people of those countries where they fought at. I wish we'll get some information later on that will give us an idea how they were received. But in times of war and battles, well, I tell you, there's not too many receptive people there.
But again, I guess picking up what Donnie was saying earlier in the show, again, it's the military kind of treating their enlisted men in a very different way than the American population were. Because if you're a serviceman and you're being stationed abroad, that means that your commanders, that line of command, trusts you, that you know how to conduct yourself, that you're going to, that you're representing your country abroad.
Right.
Right.
That's true. I think the African American soldier was very patriotic. We'll put it like that. They took the soldiering very, like a duck to water, and they didn't let all of the discrimination and the things that were going on of that during that period get in the way. They were determined to be successful, and I think they accomplished that.
Well, one person said Winners of the West, a campaign newspaper in St. Joseph, Missouri, for veterans of that period, ran articles. So there's one in Missouri.
Missouri.
Yeah,
Okay.
St. Joseph, Missouri.
Okay, all right.
So that brings us to really the top of the hour, the top of the show. Donnie, is there one more question?
Yes, there is one more question, and that question is, where did it go? Move. Okay. It was for Hamad Assad. He wanted to know, why did the Native Americans and the Buffalo Soldiers fight each other? If you can answer that like really quickly.
Yeah.
Just a brief.
Well, yeah, that's an easy one. The Buffalo Soldiers were soldiers. I mean, they were professional soldiers, and they had a job to do, and they did it. The one thing I can say, that the Buffalo Soldiers were never involved in a massacre of Native Americans, not at all. Not during the entire period they were out there.
Wow.
And we know that did happen during that period, but it wasn't any one of the historical Buffalo Soldier units. Now, there are some Native American tribes that take offense to the Buffalo Soldiers, because they think, that they were part of the problem. They were being forced to stay on reservations, and Buffalo Soldiers, especially the 24th and the 25th regiments, were garrisoned close to reservations and protected Native American on the reservations from poachers, and there was a group that tried to move into the reservation and as sitters and settle, and Buffalo Soldiers would come and run them out of there. To keep the peace, because you still had a lot of encroachment. They didn't respect the treaties that were made, and so that made it difficult, for the cavalry period. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was a very enlightening and just an awesome show. I learned a lot that I didn't know, and it just saddens me that this information isn't in history books.
It's not in the history books, and I think that's one of the things that drew me to the history. But Captain Matthews has done a masterful job in putting the museum together, and as well as his board of directors. They have a fine group of board of directors too. So I want to take the time to invite Brian, you, and Danya come down and see what it's all about.
We will. Thank you. And if there's a web, we'll get in all of the pertinent information, and we'll put it on the comment, so that people who are in Texas, because we actually have a lot of family in Texas.
Do you really? Okay.
Yeah, and we'll be able to share that information. So Brian, do you want to give them a brief of what's coming up next week?
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So as usual, you can find that on our event feeds. But Trooper Williams, thank you so much for joining us on the show, dropping your knowledge, being so generous with your time. All of you at home, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. You guys have a great Sunday and stay warm.
Bye, guys. Have a great one.
You too. Bye-bye.